Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Bolen. I'm a pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I'm also a pastor at Edgewate United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time and for watching this video. It's likely that you've probably heard this phrase, walk by faith, not by sight. Now, I don't know if that's one that you've likely used before, but it is a fairly prominent phrase that, to walk by faith and not by sight. This is a wonderful story about Jesus that happens in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 14. If you want to look it up yourself, you can. Matthew 14. It starts at verse 22, goes all the way through verse 33. But essentially what it is that Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, one who self-describes and says, you know what, I've left everything behind so that I can come and to follow you, Jesus, begins to see what him, as well as some of the other disciples, again, some of Jesus' closest people that are in a boat, and they begin to see what they assume is a ghost. But once Peter recognizes and sees that it's not a ghost that's on the water, Peter says, I want you to do something, Jesus. I want to come where you are, Jesus. I want you to imagine this. Now, Peter, as long as the rest of the disciples are in a boat, and they see what they think is a ghost, then they recognize that's not a ghost, but it's Jesus, their companion, their leader, someone that has called them, someone that they've left everything behind to come and follow him. When they see Jesus walking on the water, and Peter stands up and says, I want to walk to you on the water. Now, you've probably heard that story before, but that's what we're going to be exploring in this video, is what does it mean to walk by faith and not by sight? Because this is what Peter does in this moment. Now, what we all know about this story, especially if you've heard it before or if you've seen depictions of it before, there are depictions in art, there's depictions in music, there's depictions, all kinds of depictions of this story in movies as well. And we all know the story. We all know what happens with Peter is that Peter will step out of the boat and Peter will begin to sink very quickly in the water. And so essentially what we come to recognize is that Peter begins to sink in this water because Peter somehow took his eyes off of Jesus. That is, that he failed to see Jesus. And immediately as he starts to sink, he cries out to Jesus, Jesus, come and save me. And Jesus does. Saves him in this moment where he starts to sink. That's what we all know. That's also the kind of common way of talking about this story that comes in, once again, the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is walking on water, and then Peter tries to take that step out in faith. But why do we sink? Why is it that we sink? Why do good people who are committed followers of Jesus, much like Peter, why do we sink so often? And just one of those reasons that we start to sink. Well, we sink when there's things and events that are around us that get to be too much. We can't handle the pressure. There's times when there's storms that come into our lives and we can't seem to get over it. There are moments that we get overwhelmed and we start grasping for anything and we try to just survive. I want to tell you about one of the first trips that I took in a raft, whitewater rafting. Now this is, don't imagine the Olympics, don't imagine, huge rapids by any means. Rapids, they go all the way up to class 5, but this was on the Nantahala River, western edge of North Carolina, and these are class 1, these are class 2 rapids. So again, don't imagine TV, don't imagine anything like that. So it's not major rapids by any stretch of the imagination, but it was my first time on these rapids that are the smallest that you can ever encounter. And I was in the boat. I was a youth pastor. It was one of those wonderful opportunities I had where I was able to serve as a youth pastor. And this was a trip that we were taking the youth on. And I was in a boat with my senior pastor. So I'm the youth pastor. My senior pastor is there. We go all through the safety measures and everything like that. And so very quickly into the trip, I fell out of the boat. Now, what is supposed to happen, and this is all the training that happens like that, you're supposed to float a little bit, and then someone in the boat's supposed to put out their oar, they're supposed to put their oar out to you so that you can grab onto it so that you can safely get back into the boat. It's all supposed to be controlled, it's all supposed to be measured in such a way. That's not the way that I handled it. I fell out of the boat, and then I felt myself go under the water, and then started grasping for everything I could, got a piece of the boat, and then very quickly got my senior pastor's arm too, not his oar that he was trying to reach to grab so that he could pull me back in, but grabbed his arm like that, because that's what I was doing, is that no matter what, I was going to do anything at all. I was going to do anything that could possibly done so that I could get back in the boat. And so when water And when storms, when those kinds of things start to overtake you, don't, get that image of me trying to desperately get back in the boat. But how do you handle it? What's the kind of response that you have? And I mean, for me, it was a panicked response. And I will say this, not just in the boat, same trip for me. We went on this adventure that truly turned out to be an adventure, but we went horseback riding. And it started pouring down rain, and I was not happy being on a horse in the middle of pouring down rain, and it showed. Now this time it wasn't panic that I was experiencing. I'm not afraid. I didn't panic when I started getting wet from the rain. I was still on the horse. Horse didn't kick me off, so it wasn't panic that was there, but it was anger. It was it was anger, and it showed. So not only to my senior pastor, but it showed to the kids that were around me. Two less than spiritual responses in one trip. And that's what I want you to be. That's what I want you to begin to think about. That in your own past week, as you look over your past week, because it's really, a lot of times we tend to not think about that. We can go back, a long ways, and we can think back to those moments. But in your past week, think about that. How did you respond when things started to get overwhelming to you? How did you respond when you felt like you were sinking? When things really were overwhelming to you? And imagine whatever that response was. Imagine if we had a spiritual response when things became too much and when we start to feel overwhelmed. You see, the more steps that we take getting out of the boat, hopefully deciding to take that step on our own and not being thrown out of the boat, but the more steps that we take getting out of the boat. But yeah, we really know the reality. Sometimes we are thrown out. We don't have any control over it. But the more intentional steps that we take, getting out of the boat, walking in faith, following Jesus, even in the midst of storms, even in the midst of going out into the water, the more we will know how to do it, even when we do get thrown out. See, that's the real gift about a spiritual response to those overwhelming events that overtake us and threaten to really significantly impact our lives. You see, when we are sinking, when we are up to our necks in it, taking a step in faith. And I'm not talking about just treading water. I'm not talking about just surviving, but what we're talking about today is taking a walk in faith, taking that step in faith. That makes all the difference. The scriptures remind us of this, that we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, I've already quoted that, but it comes from 2 Corinthians, a letter that Paul writes to the Corinthian church. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, the Apostle Paul reminds us of this, for we walk by faith, not by sight. This is what we see in Peter in real time in this story when Peter sees Jesus walking on the water and says, Jesus, call me. Let me come to you on this water. When Peter sees Jesus on the water, he calls out, I want you, Jesus, to let me come to where you are, Jesus, on the water. That's a step of faith. Angela Duckworth, she does this wonderful book that is called Grit. It's called The Power of Passion and the Power of Perseverance. And she explores this idea about success. Now, I just want you to think for a minute. I want you to imagine for a minute how many times have people come to you and they said, this is what you've got to do to be successful? How many books have you read that says this is exactly what you need to do to be successful? Maybe you've even heard some sermons or some videos along the way that says this is what you should do to be successful. But what Angela Duckworth does in her book Grit is she really digs down into it. She begins to explore this idea of success. It is essentially what we Christians refer to as walking by faith, not by sight. And what she discovered is that talent, and this is based on research, what she discovered is that talent and intelligence do not always predict success. It doesn't matter about how talented you are, doesn't matter about how intelligent you are, it's not always a guarantee to success. Nor are talent and intelligence predictors of how well we are able to walk by faith. There's something else. And that something else she labels, she calls it grit. And her book is filled with all kinds of examples, all kinds of experiments of this. But according to Duckworth, Duckworth and her book, what she describes in grit, is that we develop grit when our passions, and passions, the way that she labels that, the way that she begins to define that, is our passions are these deep, enduring knowledge of what we want. It's when our passion meets perseverance, and she defines perseverance as hard work and resilience. So when our passions meets perseverance, that's when we develop grit. And this is what Peter does. This is what Peter does when his passion for Jesus stirs up this hope in him. Let me come to you on the water. And I don't remember anywhere throughout the scriptures where Jesus trains his disciples to walk on water. Jesus does train them. Jesus does train them to follow him as he does, just like us, trains each of us, calls each of us to follow him. It's essentially what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, is that you're a follower of Jesus Christ. Come on, Jesus says. It's here that Peter shows his grit. Is when Jesus says, standing on the water, Peter taking that first step off of the boat, this is where Peter shows his grit, when Jesus says, come on, come out of that boat. That passion, that perseverance of following Jesus on dry ground now sends him miraculously to take a step in the water. He doesn't sink instantly. He doesn't sink immediately. Peter has grit when he steps out of the boat. Peter walks by faith on dry ground, and now Peter walks by faith on water. Until, and you know what happens next? Until Peter starts to sink, and then Peter cries out, Lord, save me. And I wonder about you, when's the last time that you reached out and you had to say to God, Lord, save me in this moment. Lord, save me. I mean, what is it that happened? If passion and hard work, if grit got him that far, what is it that happens next? Well, at the end of Jesus' life on this earth, Jesus will invite his disciples. And Jesus understands, Jesus knows that this is very close to the end of his life. And so he invites his disciples to go with him. And he says, I want you to do something. I want you to watch, and I want you to pray. Now, it is late at night. They've had their last supper. This is, in fact, the night before Jesus is crucified. But Jesus says, I want you to watch and pray with him. And the disciples, they fall asleep. And Jesus describes this, and Jesus looking at the disciples, he describes it in this way. This is Matthew chapter 26, verse 41. He says, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. You see, in this moment, Jesus recognized something in his disciples, the closest followers that Jesus had gathered around him. He saw, as passionate as their spirits were, their own bodies could fail. As faithful as they had been, they could still sink when the moment arises. When the call comes up to watch and pray, and it comes from Jesus. You see, Peter began to sink in that moment on the water because Peter's own body failed him. Peter knew all about walking on long, dusty roads with Jesus. Peter knew about facing storms inside the boat with Jesus. Peter knew all about walking by faith and not by sight on the road, on the boat, but on the water. Well, that was a brand new experience for Peter. And it was one that quickly overwhelmed him. One where the failure of his own body could cause him to doubt everything that he knew about walking by faith and not by sight. You know, in seminary, I had a professor. Her name was Nancy Iseland, who taught me a lot about the body and showed me incredible things about weakness of the flesh. She was disabled. And significantly disabled. But by age 13, she had already undergone 11 operations for a congenital defect in her hips. And she once said that as she imagined her life on this earth and as she imagined her life in heaven, she once said, you know, without her disability, she would be absolutely unknown to herself and perhaps to God. So rather, again, she taught me so much. It was a rather bold statement to say. She's best known for a book that's called The Disabled God Toward a Liberatory Theology of Disability. And for more than 10 years, she did some amazing work with the United Nations that led them to define disabled people as subjects with rights rather than objects of charity. If you can imagine, years and years ago, even decades ago, if you can imagine the United Nations struggling to do this, to recognize that people who are disabled, that they're in fact subjects, that they're in fact human beings, that are created in the image of God, and they have rights. They're not just objects that should be pitied and offered charity. Jesus saw Peter still in the boat, exactly the way that God sees all of us. Peter had never stepped out of the boat. Peter had never walked on water, never navigated walking on water in the face of a strong wind. And we may read over and over and study over and over, and even in our own lives and our own bodies, we may discover that over and over our spirits are much stronger, that they are much willing than our bodies are at times. Indeed, as the scriptures remind us, our spirits are willing, but oftentimes our flesh is too weak. Yet Jesus looks to us and continues to call us. Jesus continues to call us, even when our bodies are not ready. If we never step out in faith, we will never discover those places that Jesus is calling us to. For me, my second time in a boat rafting. Now these were the kind of rapids that you could probably imagine. These are rapids that are class 3, class 4, a couple of class 5. I mean, these are the big rapids. I didn't fall out of the boat the second time. It was the last thing that I wanted to do. Also, the waters are much more dangerous when you fall out. But I knew a lot more. And I was more relaxed than my first time. A lot more walking by faith rather than the alternative and sinking in the water. You see, this is what it means to follow Jesus. That each time that we take a step out in faith, each time we walk by faith and not by sight, each time that we have this spiritual response when we start to sink, we are becoming more and more like Jesus. And we are ready for that next step out of the boat, ready for that next moment in the wind and the waves. Because, we've been there before. You see, the more that we offer a spiritual response to those moments that overwhelm us, those moments that we sink, the more ready we are for that next step out of the boat. Imagine starting today, one step out of your boat that you find yourself in. One step closer to Jesus in spite of the wind, in spite of the water, or whatever you may be facing. Sure, you may sink. Sure, your body may be too weak this time. But thanks be to God that Jesus is here to save you. And when Jesus is here to save us, none of us have a single thing to lose when we take a step in faith. Not based on what we can see, but take a step in faith and we get out of the boat. Thanks be to God that even though our bodies may be weaker than our spirits are, that's when Jesus saves us. That's when Jesus reaches out his hand and Jesus picks us up, even people like us. And if we take a step out, we're going to be so much more ready the next step and the next step. And we will find that taking a step out in faith, that's when we become a little more like Jesus. Well, thank you so much for watching. I do encourage you, walk by faith, not by sight. Take a step out and see what happens. Well, thanks again for watching. May God's blessings be upon all of you, both now and forevermore. Amen.